Our first speaker today is Professor Ackbar Abbas. Ackbar Abbas studied and taught at Hong Kong University for almost 40 years. He was at one time the chair of comparative literature and co-director of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures. Currently, he is professor of comparative literature at UCHRI. His best known works is Hong Kong Culture and the Politics of Disappearance, first published by the University of Minnesota Press in 1997, and also available from the University of Hong Kong. Recently, he has been returning more frequently to Hong Kong to give lectures and seminars, particularly at Lingnan University, but also at other institutions, including Hong Kong University and Tai Kung. So without further delay, Ackbar, I would like to move and you can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. So firstly, warm thank you to the organizers for making this event possible. So to Roberto and Lisa, Holly, the graduate students who helped out. Now, I seem to recall that Roberto and Lisa told us that the first day's presentation would be more conceptual and theoretical, while the second day today would be directed more to particular case studies. So I will try to follow that guideline. My case studies will be 4 films, and I will focus specifically on one detail in each film around which the whole story turns, and which at the same time turns the whole story around. I will end by trying to draw out some implications about race and racism from the 4 films. Now, the title of my short talk is The Doxic as Toxic, the Racism of Good Intentions. And of course, doxic is the adjective from doxa, and doxa, of course, means popular beliefs strongly but uncritically held, right? So the doxic as toxic. Now, recall an early scene in Bruce Lee's 1972 film, Fists of Fury, made in Hong Kong, but set in Shanghai around 1910 during the dark days of foreign domination. Bruce, you remember, is forbidden to enter a public park by a racist sign that reads, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." His response is to do a flying kick, smashing the sign to pieces. Yet this anti-racist scene, full of righteous indignation, includes one disturbing detail. The film presents the park's Indian gatekeeper in a clearly ridiculous way, with no awareness of how inadvertently racist such a portrayal is. So protesting against racism and being racist are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. This is the first conundrum, how anti-racism and racism can be mirror images of each other. One image, the parodic double of the other. Now note that, of course, this is parody with no overt satiric or critical edge, what Frederick Jameson once called blank parody. Such parody makes dealing with racism akin to moving through a house of mirrors. Now, perhaps because racism is so non-obvious and dissembling, there is a tendency to simplify or deflect it, turning a complex question into a more understandable cliche. Consider now my second case study. Li Ang's mainstream film Brokeback Mountain, released in 2005, about 2 gay cowboys living in a redneck community, a community that defends its homophobic and racist tendencies at all costs, not stopping at gratuitous violence and even murder. In its sympathetic portrayal of the gay couple and in its critical representation of the rednecks, Lee's film is clearly addressed to a liberal democratic audience. The more bigoted the redneck behavior, the more tolerant and open-minded the audience can feel itself to be. One typical comment on this film, an example of open-mindedness, is to say it's not about homosexuality, it's about love, which turns out on examination to be a crucial but double-edged response. The inclusive gesture excludes at the same time other forms of love, right? The statement is, it's not about homosexuality, as if homosexuality as such cannot be a form of love and is only tolerated if it is normalized and not different. Just as toxic and murderous as redneck prejudice is homogenization and conditional toleration. I will include you on condition that you become like me. This then is the deep, dark secret of Brokeback Mountain, that toleration may be bigotry's double rather than its opposite. What the film enacts is a blank parody of toleration, taking us another step towards the racism of good intentions. I turn for my third example to Danish director Lars von Trier, the enfant terrible of European cinema. He's notorious for taking things to catastrophic extremes, as if it were only at such moments that the real shows its true face. In Cannes 2011, goaded by some reporters over his German ancestry and how this might be related by implication to racism and misogynism, to the racism and misogynism of his films, Lars von Trier blurted out in exasperation finally, he said, okay, I'm a Nazi. I understand Hitler. Now, these remarks, of course, got him banned from Cannes, even though he was a previous prize winner. Now, perhaps von Trier was fighting a simplification with a simplification of his own. And this suggests that we have to return to the structural complexities of the films themselves. My example from von Trier is his 2003 film, Dogville, specifically one detail in it. The story, you remember, concerns Grace, played by Nicole Kidman, who appears one day in Dogville, pursued by gangsters. The townspeople give her refuge, but also exploit her vulnerable position. She has to do twice the work of other people for half the pay. And one after another of the men rape her. Grace responds to her situation with stoicism and forgiveness. How is this possible? Is she too good to be true? One answer is suggested by a small detail in the film. Right? The only occasion when she breaks down and cries is when Vera, one of the townswomen, spitefully smashes up her collection of ceramic figurines. Right? She doesn't cry when she's raped or tortured, but when her figurines are smashed up, she cries. She breaks down to cry. Now, these figurines made in Dogville are like tourist souvenirs. And this is an important detail because it points to the possibility that Grace's moral fortitude is that of the tourist who knows she can leave at any time. And that, of course, this of course is related to the popularity popularity today of disaster tourism, right? We visit these areas and we feel morally outraged, but we know we can leave at any time. Now, this supposition is confirmed when we learn that Grace is in fact the daughter of a mafia boss, running away not from gangsters or from the police, but from a loving and overprotective father. Towards the end, there's an explosive dialogue between Grace and her father, who accuses her of arrogance. And it turns out that the father is not just a common thug, but something of a dialectician. So let me just quote you this short dialogue between them. This is the crucial bit. So it begins with Grace replying to her father. So I'm arrogant. I'm arrogant because I forgive people. That makes me arrogant. The father says, my God, can't you see how condescending you are when you say that? You have this preconceived notion that nobody, listen, nobody can possibly attain the same high ethical standards as you. So you exonerate them. I cannot think of anything more arrogant than that. You, my child, my dear child, forgive others with excuses that you would never in the world permit for yourself. So to forgive in others what you would not forgive in yourself is to disrespect them and to say indirectly that you are better than they are. So arrogance. The disastrous conclusion that Grace draws from this dialectic is that to respect the people of Dockville means also giving them the punishment they deserve for what they have done, which is death. With the power from her father, she now orders the town's destruction. Dockville is burnt to the ground and everybody is killed, men, women, and children. Only one dog, Moses, is spared. So Dockville does have a dog, right? Different dog from Bruce Lee's dog, but it does have a dog. But note also that the catastrophe, the final turning point, is not just the spectacle of the town's destruction. It is also the catastrophe of the implosion of differences, the fusion and confusion of forgiveness and arrogance, of power and virtue, right? Which turn out to be blank parodies of each other. Structurally similar to Dockville, the last case study I will discuss is Jordan Peele's 2019 film, Us. The film concerns a Black family, the Wilsons, and in particular, Adelaide or Addie Wilson. But race is never directly mentioned. In fact, the Wilsons' best friends are the Tylers, who are white. Most of the film seems to be a kind of horror story about how the Wilson family on vacation are terrorized by a zombie family very much like their own, their parodic double. The horror story works together also with the sci-fi genre about clones and replicants. And Blade Runner, of course, is the classic example of this. A third genre is the government conspiracy story about how the government created as an experiment a race of clones which are tethered, linked to ordinary citizens and used to control them. So it's this film that uses all these mixed genres, and it seems to be all of it there to shock us. But if these stories about zombies, clones, and government control shock us, they do so in a very conventional way. I mean, in fact, a lot of people watching the film get really impatient with that. I mean, we've seen all this before. Shock becomes schlock. And schlock, of course, is the expected shock in the expected place. Schlock does not shock us out of our complacencies. Now, this brings me now to the crucial detail that the film begins and ends with. A bit of spoiler alert here. It brings us to Peele's film, which is a horror story of a very different kind. The film, you remember, begins with a strange incident that happened to Eddie as a child in an amusement park. She wandered away from her parents into a house of horrors where she met her double. We don't know how the scene ends, only that she was so traumatized she could not speak for a long time. It is only in the very last minutes that we learn how this opening scene played out. The double that she met had grabbed Eddie by the throat and changed clothes and places with her. So the ordinary woman we have been empathizing with throughout the film is actually the clone, right? While the terrorizing zombie is actually Eddie, right? So this switch or doubling requires us to watch the film all over again, to double back, as it were. Just as we need to retrace our views on racism to see how the racism of good intentions might work out. Now, let me try now to draw out 3 points. I'll take on a few more minutes from my case histories. One question they ask is why democracy, social justice, belief in diversity, and so on, have not only not put an end to racism, but have instead given rise to racism by other means. Perhaps we need to pose the question differently for it to be fruitful and ask not why racism persists, but how it persists. I would suggest as a first point that it persists in posthumous form. The posthumous here referring to a life, a renewed vitality based on the condition or alibi of its death and disappearance, right? So it's this double thing. It's not just afterlife. It's in fact renewed vitality, but based on the condition or alibi of its death and disappearance. So the posthumous empties racism as we know it of overt content, kills it, but keeps the form or structure that could then recharge itself by appropriating any content, whatever. Hence, racism can be an issue even when the subject seems to be about something else. Hence, a second point. Posthumous racism operates on the model of hysteria. Its symptoms are puzzling. Unlike organic symptoms, which are related to a cause, like for example, you have a stomach ache because you ate some unclean food. So symptom related to a cause, stomach ache, cause, unclean food. Hysterical symptoms are relatively arbitrary. For example, anxiety can display itself in all kinds of ways, as a blush or paleness of the face, as an inability to speak, or as an inability to stop speaking. So symptoms of racism too are relatively arbitrary, often seemingly unrelated to issues of racism at all. This suggests then finally a third point, that racism cannot be understood or analyzed in isolation. It is part of a larger social ecology, just as ecology itself is not just green. Now, this is a huge task, but the happy corollary is that we are also fighting racism every time we resist a cliche, however well-intentioned. Thank you.